Hello, my friends. This is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie. And tonight, I am taking a stroll and doing a little recording while I walk. And what's unique about tonight is that I'm sort of recording in lieu of a few notes that I've taken in terms of what I hope to speak about. And first, I'd like to point out that the very idea, the moniker of middle child, means that I am a child of the middle. Means that I'm a sort of explorer of the nooks and crannies, the vestibules and bridges that link one thing to another, that connect one thing to another. And so that's what middle child means to me, is to explore the tension between ideas. Because I find that over time, if philosophy is an investigation of ideas, as I think it is, I mean, not only is philosophy predicated on asking specific questions and sort of imposing certain standards of evidence, it also has to do with the exploration of ideas. And this goes back to Thales, philosopher who made a huge leap forward when he began thinking about explanations of things in terms of the things themselves, in terms of reality itself, which is another thing that we take for granted, you know? It's sort of built into our culture, our resistance to so-called anthropomorphism. You know, that's deep in us. Obviously, there's a very powerful reason why we resist we resist animism, as it's called, and animism represents a huge variety. It's like saying theism and animism are very single belief, but a huge variety of beliefs that have something in common. And that's precisely what the Greeks, whether Thales or Plato, don't have in common with them. And again, one has to emphasize the fact that other people are obviously thinking in rational ways, and I think very much in ways that are contingent upon their very existence in the world, and it's a universal human trait. But what happens in the Greeks, it would just be stupid to ignore the profundity in terms of what happened in Thales with the emergence of naturalistic explanations, and also in Plato with the emergence of a cool, level-headed, rational examination of problems. I mean, it's important. Sorry, there might have been an audio problem there. But I just think it's important to illustrate the fact that with Thales and his invention of a naturalistic explanation, and with Plato and his invention of the secular, speculative explanation, there's the emergence not of something that's like a biological thing, because it's all rooted in the epigenetics that emerges in us thousands of years before Plato, but isn't biological. And what I mean by that is that Plato ultimately invented ideas that are so powerful that we can't think our way out of it. I mean, another idea that's integral to Plato and to so much of what we are as a people, you know, speaking as a person that I am, is his optimism. You know, Plato, it's taken for granted that the Greeks and Plato are optimistic, but you always have to think you have to think kind of contextually, in the sense that we always have to think in comparison to something else. That the Greeks are not existing in a vacuum. The ancient Greeks, and I'm not a Greekophiliac, so I don't fawn over these people, and I'm not Greek myself in the sense that I don't really look up to or idolize the Homeric Greek or anything like that, because I know that I don't have it in me. I know that kind of life is something that I just literally cannot live out. And so I understand myself as being made of various other elements. But the Greek is the most pronounced. And if there's anything in me that's like an essence or a spirit, it's my own Promethean tendencies, meaning that I tend to prefer the Greek. And when I say I prefer the Greek, I mean that I prefer a naturalistic explanation of events, and I also prefer a free-floating and a dialectical conversation with other people. And I think that that's where the great value is to be had. And I don't think that this conversation can be reduced to any kind of mechanical methodology. In fact, it's very open-ended and very messy. And what's interesting about reading Plato, or a lot of the great philosophers, is that they are incredibly messy because we are messy, and so it's a mistake to think that what you're doing in philosophy is reflecting a mind that in fact doesn't exist. And so what I mean to suggest is that although these notions are important to me, I'm fairly agnostic about these notions, about Plato and Thales. Yet I think that it's crucial to think about the relation between ideas in a public space that involves other people. Because the dialectic isn't something that you do deductively on your own. It's something that's more like a call and response with other people. And what's funny is I haven't even gotten near to speaking about what I had sort of proleptically planned on speaking about, which is the relationship between certain ideas. Because I think the value is that there's a kind of friction or a kind of imaginative splurge that occurs when we think about ideas in relation to one another. So it's not just about a person-to-person dialectical relation. It's all about the dialectical relation within you. And so, although I value the conversation as a primary mode of being philosophical, you have to do the work within yourself. You have to do the thinking within yourself, because the only way you can have a productive philosophical conversation is if you've both sort of done the work and you're able to play with one another. So there's a certain balancing act required, and I think what's essential is that one is able to, within themselves, understand the complexity of ideas, in the sense that for every idea you have, there is an opposite. And it's not that these are symmetrical opposites or that it can be understood in any kind of order, but that it would behoove you to be able to take seriously, at least for a few moments, the point of view that you're arguing against. And what I mean is that what they call cognitive dissonance is referring to precisely this, which is that not only must you be able to keep alive different ideas that contradict one another within yourself, you have to be able to choose ultimately and live out the consequences of those ideas, because it's not merely within you that this work happens. These ideas are always connected to our lives, and that's an idea that's really important to me, is that ideas are not divorced from reality. We are living out the ideas, and I'm not an idealist or a solipsist or even a social constructivist or anything like that, but I do think that there's a sense in which when you begin questioning in a neutral and a sort of open, nice way, you begin questioning others, or if you have to, you begin forcefully questioning authority, you are practicing the philosophical discipline of challenging those built-in ideas. And not only that, but if you could explore alternatives publicly, you're more likely to reach a resolution that's conducive to the actual situation. And so, at the same time, I think it's much more valuable to turn that light within and to begin questioning your own ideas and begin sustaining within your own private space, insofar as you can even do such a thing. I'm not sure such a thing can even be said to exist, but if thinking is to exist, if people are to think on their own and then reach decisions autonomously, then the precondition for that is the capacity to test out alternative ideas and to explore the idea that you're not right and that other ideas can be helpful. And not only that, it's valuable to get used to the uncertainty that is ultimately induced by this, because when you explore many different points of view at once, you become more and more aware of your own limitations. And in fact, over time, you'll become more and more hesitant about making grandiose claims. And not only that, but on a physical, sort of political level, you find that these compromises are also things that you make that are to be valued politically, that you're not trying to trump the other point of view or wipe them out, but to coexist in a plural world. And it's not as if there's relativism here. It's not as if everybody were right. In fact, most people are wrong, and a few people are a little bit more right about different things at different times. But there's a sense in which what we're doing is keeping alive the imaginative inner life of our culture, if not of people, then of our culture. So it could be that what we call the inner world is a function of the public space. And I don't know what that means, but I suppose it's because I'm sort of trying to feel out a way of understanding interiority that isn't metaphysical. And of course I'm speaking in super philosophical language, but I'm also speaking for, I guess, a lot of the different kinds of philosophers out there, kind of just throwing things out there and sort of seeing what comes back. And so I suppose that's sort of like a prelude to examining what I had set forth, because what I had set forth was to be rooted in the very walking, the act of walking itself in the city at night. I mentioned before in a recording, I think called Nocturnes, that I really love walking in the city at night. And for me, it's connected with the experience of wonder. And so wonder is a fundamental idea in us. You could say that it's an experience, but one doesn't have access to the inner lives of people enough to confirm the idea that what we call wonder or bewilderment is necessarily a universal human experience. You know, it's sort of an opening question that I don't think anyone can resolve, but is wonder universal, or are there cultures that allow for it? And if so, I suppose the question is, what do I mean by wonder? You know, wonder is sort of an emotional experience. I mean, in the sense that it's associated with a tingling sense of awe that I get simply by walking around at night. And you find in philosophy that some philosophers say that philosophy begins in wonder, that this very experience of exhilaration, of bewilderment, of confusion, perhaps despair mixed with joy, that in itself was something to be made sense of, and that we could call that wonder is one thing. But I think that wonder is also separate from seeing life as a set of problems, because wonder inflects a kind of wisdom, in the sense that if there is wisdom, it is connected with wonder, I think, at least insofar as our wonder is an experience of the world that can be understood as a corollary to two other ways of experiencing the world. And one is that it's a set of problems, that you're born into a set of problems, you know, that have to be solved. And we might take that for granted, but that's only a way of thinking about the world that's predicated on certain assumptions that are already being made. And it's difficult to get a person to challenge those conditions in themselves because of how difficult it is to even access what it is that makes you who you are. And I also think that's why the experience of wonder can be very helpful and conducive as at least a balancing act to the people who are thinking of life as a set of problems to be solved, and therefore thinking of themselves as a problem solver. I think that itself is an error in thinking that's representative of our times and of how we are in the world. But what is this other way of being in the world? Well, I think that one more thing could be said about the last way of being in the world, which is that it's a set of problems. And it's to add on a clause, which is that for most people, life is so overwhelmingly difficult and painful. And I don't mean to be dramatic about it, but most people are born into situations where the pressure of life in all of its various forms is very serious, and I think it's to be taken seriously, because what it ultimately dampens in us is the first thing that I mentioned, which is experience. I mean wonder, the experience of wonder. And so I think wonder in itself, I don't know where it comes from, but I've always felt it. When I was younger, my experience of it's like a tingling sensation, like you find later when Emily Dickinson talks about how she knows what poetry is when her senses begin tingling, when the hair on her arms is standing up. To me, that's approximate to the kind of experience of wonder that I had as a young person. And it wasn't an intellectual wonder. It later came to become an intellectual wonder, but it was actually the experience of just wowness, And, I remember, I think Steve Jobs, his last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." And I think that that's in many ways indicative of our entire lives, just the very rhythm of that, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow, in many ways expresses the whole. And I think that the experience of wonder may be rooted in that, and it may be that in relation to what I was saying just a moment ago about the pressures of life, the form and pressures of life, is that it's no wonder that philosophy as a historical cultural institution is ultimately predicated itself on what turns out to be slave owning, or perhaps immoral, or perhaps egregious cultures, people, activities, in the sense that the activity of philosophy demands a kind of leisure, a kind of freedom that allows for that feeling of wonder. And so there is a sense in which it's only when you're relatively safe and relatively free from the serious problems of getting food, of keeping your family safe, that you're even close to having the philosophical experience of wonder. But again, these are just open-ended explorations of that concept that I think is so fundamental to the philosophical, because in many ways the feeling of wonder is the opening up of our imagination. And I think in later recordings I'll get around to maybe explaining what I mean by imagination and what this can mean. But what I meant to explore in this recording is the city itself as an idea. The city is something that hasn't existed that long in the entirety of human civilization, or in the entirety of human existence, in the sense that we've been human beings for far longer, perhaps 90% or more, not living in cities, but living in very small groups, effectively wandering different parts of the earth, perhaps traversing into broader spaces from time to time. And I'm not a primitivist or a Luddite, and I'm not one to suggest that cities are bad, but cities are a very unique experiment in the entirety of the human affair. And the city represents in many ways the imposition of order upon a kind of chaos, and for good reason. The city ultimately offers a protection against the country. Not that the country that I'm saying, the word that I'm using here doesn't refer to the country like country people, but in the sense of referring to whatever it is that's outside of the gates of the city. And in many ways, the city is reflective of not only the kind of order that economically we've imposed on the world, but the kind of order that our minds impose on the world. Because we are, in many ways, in our minds, Plato's progeny, in the sense that our very understanding of the city is rooted in Plato's understanding of the mind, in the sense of the city becomes what it becomes in Augustine, in the City of God, or what it becomes in Aquinas, which is a kind of mental city. And I think, of course, of those lines from Rihanna about waking up in the city of wonder. I think she says, "Put on your brake lights, you're in the city of wonder, so hang tight." I think she's suggesting, at least to me, the city within the mind, the city of wonder. And I think that in many ways this wonder is a taste for the wilderness from which we come. And so it's a sense that the city in itself is predicated on what it is not, and that is the country. And so it's no wonder that in Plato, there are moments when I think someone else calls out Socrates and says, you don't go out into the country. You know, you're just a city dweller. So what do you know, basically? Like, you've never lived with the farmers. And I think Socrates says something like, the people come to me, and that being in the city, I am around enough people who effectively bring life to me. And of course, it's the beginning of a period in philosophy that would ultimately have crazy different side effects over time. But it's indicative of a way of thinking of ourselves in the world in a way that would come to mean a fundamental assumption that we don't really question. And it's not that we can question the city. It's not that we can live in any other way. I don't think we have any alternative, perhaps to cities, perhaps to capital. But I think that, at least in our own imaginations, we can keep alive a sense of how strange it is that we attempt to organize ourselves in such hyper-bureaucratic, hyper-rational ways. I mean, it's very strange that we are living out the consequences of decisions that our ancestors made some tens of thousands of years ago. And of course, it could be that there was no other way, and that once these decisions were made, there was no going back. But I think that, again, that's no way of dismissing the philosophical enterprise, because to examine yourself, which is what philosophy is about, is to encounter these ideas and to understand that they're not historically determined, but they have a historical reality, and that we ourselves have a historical reality. If it doesn't determine what we are, I don't think it does. I think what is wild still in us is that which grants the autonomy. Almost the ignorance of the knowledge we know is what gives us the freedom we, at least on an illusory level, think we experience. And so I think that the fruit of philosophy is that it is always performing a kind of exercise that can be beneficial so long as it's done in the right way. I think that philosophy, to philosophize, requires a certain kind of finesse, a certain kind of cunning that almost can't be taught, you know? How could you teach irony, for instance? And I think that in many ways, philosophy has museumized itself. I mean, it's become a museum entity in the sense that the way that philosophy is generally taught is that they're sort of keeping alive a tradition without actually performing that tradition. And hence, performative philosophy means, in many ways, keeping up that activity of augmenting or edifying our experience in lieu of the capacity philosophy has to subject our thinking to rational speculative norms. However, I don't think that philosophy is what life is about. I think it's ludicrous to think that there are big philosophical problems that are out there to be solved. I think that philosophy is something that sort of happens to some people almost temperamentally as a function of their relation to the world. And so it can be said that one can be philosophical and another person can exist in another way. And I think that's true. And so I think that on a certain level, it's not a universal institution. It's an institution that is kept alive by a certain language and a certain set of operations, but these themselves can be challenged. And one way I like to challenge it in my own little way is by examining other ideas that are sort of overlooked. For instance, the idea of the city. You know, what is the city? And what is the ideal city? What is a beautiful city? What is a just city? What is a true city? What are honest people? Why do we understand ourselves in relation to the city? It's a recent event. We now understand our own desires in relation to the culture that a city creates. That sort of teaches us how to think, or at least shapes the way that we think. And so I think this is quite valuable as a way of at least heuristically exploring ideas and themes that can ultimately perhaps be beneficial. And I have a huge philosophical imagination in that regard. And I guess that's what I'm doing, is performing my own dialectic while walking. Just a featherless, bipedal, balding eagle. And I guess that's what I am. And so here I am performing my own song while walking at night. Because I think, as I've said before, perhaps wandering with a W-A-N is connected to wondering. And so I'm always wandering as a child between these ideas. And I suppose what I'm keeping alive is a particular kind of public-private space where ideas can live and be kept alive. And it's much in the same way that a jazz musician or artist keeps alive certain themes that are ultimately uplifting in the way that aesthetic themes are uplifting, or aesthetic motifs. And so I also think that you could understand ideas more powerfully when you're understanding them in relation to one another. And that's sort of the other idea within this, is that you don't understand the city as an idea, but you also have to understand its corollary in the relation between the city and the country. And so what is the country, What is the wilderness? What is civilization? What is the mind and what is the brain? Now, are those even correct corollaries? See, that's another trap you can fall into, is to mistake a false division for being a real one. So some ideas are not really real unless it's understood as a historical phenomenon. I don't have much interest in ideas of the mind or the subject, because I prefer a much more fleshly, existential reality. And so I think that some of the ideas that I explore and examine and the relationships between are of my own, because that's a part of the project of thinking outside of the traditional philosophical options. Not that there's a lot of great teachers out there, in the sense that there's a lot of great philosophy teachers out there that are really, really great. And I've seen a lot of them on video. And there's a lot of great philosophy textbooks out there and introductory text into philosophy. But one has to admit that there's a sort of lack of imagination, a lack of real play in a lot of them. And I think that's what I want to do, is sort of change the tenor of that philosophical tradition, in the sense that I'd like to bring into it my own philosophical ideas, in the sense that I want to examine the relationship between the celestial and the terrestrial, because I think that's the other kind of experience, in the sense that it's fourfold, right? You have the experience that's like a tension between the country and the city, but the other tension is between the celestial and the terrestrial. That's what's so interesting, is that if you drive out into the country, at least in Missouri where I live, you start to get a very mind-opening sense of the cosmos, because the lack of pollution allows a certain kind of clarity, a certain kind of insight. And when you look around the wilderness in the country and you see that in comparison to the stars, I think that induces a kind of wonder. And so perhaps wonder comes out of the same kind of place within us that irony comes out of, in the sense that it has to do with a kind of harmony or disharmony between elements. And it could be that the very precondition for this is the kind of openness that allows you to sustain the kind of different moving motions that can make music over time. And of course, dear listener, I don't mean to sound like I'm trying to be smart. I'm trying to give birth to ideas that are not ideas in themselves, but are in relation to my own situatedness. And I think that it's a mistake to think of philosophical problems as being a waste of time, because what you ultimately do is sort of eat away at, and as I said, edify and augment your own relation to the world. And so when it's done well, I think it opens you up ultimately to what is really wise, which is just the immediacy of life itself. Just the value of life itself is what's to be discovered, in the sense that that is the high pinnacle of thought. It isn't thought in itself, it's what thought is like a vehicle towards, or an opening towards. You could say that the point of thought is to get out of its own way, or the point of philosophy or thinking is to get out of its own way, so that life in its own like spontaneous, natural way can work itself out, you know? I think that that's in many ways what I'm trying to do. Not to be a philosopher, but to be nothing, just to get out of my own way, so that I can be whatever I am inside, if that makes sense. And I suppose the reason why I'm doing these recordings is that I am fairly clear about what I think, what notions there are that I do believe, because it's not about believing nothing. In many ways, it's about seeing what you can affirm. And so philosophy, as the title of one book, it is a stepping back. And that stepping back gives you a kind of perspective. And the pursuit of a cohesive, coherent perspective in many ways is the role of philosophy. But you ultimately have to step back into life. And I think it's a lot like driving into the country, or it's a lot like looking up into the stars. You suddenly have this like really deep experience of wonder, and it must be that wonder is a precondition, if not for philosophy, then for something else. And it could be that wonder is the opening up of a kind of space, so that wonder isn't understood. Wonder perhaps is the only idea that isn't understood in relation to other ideas. Wonder is the one idea that has to do with a state of mind. It has to do with a disposition or an attitude. So you could say that wonder is a frame of mind that allows philosophy and life to operate, because within the experience of wonder, one can examine all the various extremes of thought. And so long as wonder is sustained and one isn't collapsing back into the impossible difficulties of life, you're able to really examine all the different options and pluralities of values and people. And perhaps if there is a corollary to wonder, it would be war, you know, in the sense that war is an idea that we don't really understand. It's an idea that is an idea, but it's a reality whose immensity goes far beyond anything we can even coherently understand unless you live through it. And I say that as someone who hasn't lived through it, but I say that as someone who can see the horizon of my own imagination, in the sense that I've been around people who have been through war. And so I think war is to be understood as in dialectical relation with wonder. If wonder is to represent the leisure and security and peace that is given by civilization, then one has to see also that civilization is rooted in war. And yet I haven't defined that, nor can I here. I think I'll leave that here as a placeholder for further examination, because what I'm discovering in this recording is that it's not my own monologue that creates value. It's really the dialogue within me, wherein I'm not describing an idea, but describing a relation between ideas. And I suppose that's what I mean by middle child. I say child because I don't see myself as a professional. I am a child, and in many ways, that's all that I can do, is to play in the face of all of this, of these paths, and to open myself up to the difficulty of having to finish my sentences and to speak with some kind of syntactical clarity, which is what recording demands of you and writing demands of you. And that's why putting these recordings out there is not for any attention or to do anything, but really it's a pivotal step in my own my own evolution as a person, because in speaking publicly, you put demands on yourself that you otherwise would not put on yourself. And so you don't really earn the freedom that you could earn by placing those demands. And a part of those demands is sort of learning the tradition. Studying Plato and studying Kant have immense value in this regard. And it's not because you learn anything in terms of like the information that's gained, but that you pick up, like almost through osmosis, a particular kind of methodology that allows you to perform the philosophical. And it could be that the philosophical is not really about wonder. If wonder is some big speculative, like quasi-romantic experience, then war is earth. Like war is the opposite. War is the reality of life in its utter necessity, when there's no room for speculative thinking and all must collapse in a purely instrumental reason. I think that's the dialectical tension within civilization. And that's the dialectical tension that, if there is anything like violence in speech, it's in that. But I don't know. I leave this recording not as an achievement in terms of content, but as an achievement in terms of augmenting my own approach, because I'm trying to get better at this. And I'm only getting better at this by pushing myself to do what I think comes natural, which is being what I already am. So this is Middle Child, the real John Edward Woolley, signing off.